Okay, so as I was saying, excavations at Shanidar Cave were undertaken between 1951 and 1960 by Ralph Selecki, and you can see him here on the left. This is during the excavation of Shanidar 4, the famous flower burial, which we'll come back to. Here on the right is T. Dale Stewart, who was the physical anthropologist on the project from sort of the middle of the project itself, so he wasn't on board at the beginning. So in terms of the site itself, this on the left shows you the excavations that Selecki undertook. So very large scale. You can see T. Dale Stewart down here excavating Shanidar 4, and that will become relevant as we progress. This is a plan of the cave. So what you can see here is the grid that Selecki himself laid out, and the numbers refer to the numbers of the Neanderthal individuals that he discovered, but also a few that we've come across, and I'll talk more about those obviously in this talk. So to give you an idea of the stratigraphy, this is a digitization of one of Selecki's kind of schematic cross sections of the site. So we'll be mainly talking about his period D, which equates to the Middle Paleolithic, the Mousterian. Sometimes people say, you know, he dug that as a whole layer, but that's not true. He did distinguish layers within that. What's important for today is to bear in mind that there are two phases in which we find Neanderthal skeletal remains, and I think that's often not recognized as well. So the older phase is this one, about 75,000 years ago, and that's where we find Shanidar 4, 6, 8, and 9, Shanidar 2, Shanidar 7, and the more recently identified remains, very partial, of Shanidar 10. So they're shown in red here on the plan. What we have then is another group about 45,000 years ago, which includes Shanidar 1, Shanidar 3, and Shanidar 5. So they're the ones that are shown here in green. Of course, many of you might well have heard of Shanidar Cave. The legacy of the excavations undertaken by Ralph Selecki has been huge in our field. This is Selecki's book, his account of his excavations, the first flower people, and of course that's playing on the idea of the flower burial, and also Eric Trinkhouse's seminal work on the skeletal remains, the Shanidar Neanderthals. Again, just to sort of get us all on the same page, you probably heard about this, but the reason why the site has been so influential is because of its implications for Neanderthal care and compassion, and potentially the treatment of the dead. So here we have Shanidar 1 from about 45,000 years ago, with multiple injuries, multiple disabilities, some people have characterized them as, including a hedge injury here on the left side, which probably left him blind in that eye. On his right humerus, probably amputated just above the elbow, and this very withered appearance suggests that he was paralyzed down that side. These injuries probably happened when he was sort of a young adult, but he survived until perhaps at the age of around 45. Similarly, Shanidar 3 has been used an example of potential care and compassion, but also of violence. So this is the left 9th rib, and you can see here a projectile injury quite clearly, but some healing around it. So the argument is that he would have had to survive a number of months to get this healing, and yet he would have required some care. The lung was probably collapsed, so he would have required some support. His remains were quite scattered, so you can see that here in the picture, aspects in articulation, others more scattered around, and this is probably to do with shifting of the cave sediments. Then, of course, we have the famous flower burial, Shanidar 4. So this is him in plan, and what you can see is that there's various samples marked on here. This is where sediment samples were taken. They were analysed and found to contain these clusters of pollen, including things like the hollyhock that you see here. And we'll come back quite a bit to Shanidar 4 and later to the flower burial idea. So since 2011, the Shanidar Cave project has been established. It was at the invitation of the Kurdish regional government that Professor Graham Barker, who you see here, was invited to begin new excavations, the first excavations since 1960 at the cave. And this was with the support of the Directorate of Antiquities and Heritage. You can see the signing of the permits here, and also the more local Director of Antiquities and Heritage, Abdul Wahab Suleiman, who you see here on the left. In terms of the excavations themselves, this is how the site has changed over the years. So here we have the site in 1960. You can see Ralph Selecki's substantial trench open here. This is during the excavation. Over the years, it became backfilled. There were people living in the cave up until the 90s, I think, and they were still living here at the time of these excavations, herders who were bringing their sheep and goats between the high Zagros and the lower areas here. So that's became backfilled over time. We've removed a lot of this backfill, so reopening the original trench that Selecki dug. Obviously, these kind of excavations are very hard to do these days, but the point of the project has been to try and understand things like the chronology, the environment, the ways that modern humans and Neanderthals were occupying the site, how that changed according to climatic conditions. The way this has been done has been largely through excavating sample columns at the edge of these original excavations, so really high resolution excavations that can tie in then with the original data from Selecki. There are a few areas of open excavation, like here, and this is where Shanidar 5 was found, and we found a few more bits of his skeleton. Also Shanidar 3 here, Shanidar 1 just here. Down here, where you can see my colleague, Chris Hunt, this is where we saw Dale Stewart in one of the previous pictures. And Chris here is looking at the new remains that we found in 2016. So, as I said, the point of the project was not to find new Neanderthal remains. It was about reconstructing the environment and behavior and so forth. However, as always, and as perhaps Selecki found, expect the unexpected, right? So as we were clearing the backfill from this, what's called the deep sounding, so that's where Chris was in the previous picture, we found this area of concentration of bones. This we were able to link back to Selecki's excavations. So here's another photo of Selecki and Stewart looking at the remains of Shanidar 4 in situ. You'll notice there's this rock behind Dale Stewart's hand, this one here. Through various pictures, we've been able to match that up with this one here. So essentially the remains we've been looking at are right here, next to Shanidar 4. We named the remains Shanidar Zed. So initially, all we could see was the remains here in the section. We had to extend then the excavations further back into the section. The first thing we came down on as we excavated from above was this very heavily crushed skull. So hopefully you can see here, we've got the eye socket, we've got the lower jaw, the mandible, we've got the upper jaw here, and here's the cranial vault. Very difficult to excavate, as I will come on to. Underneath the skull, we then have this left forearm, so you can see the hand here tightly flexed, the shoulder girdle here, and parts of the right arm. Sorry, the left arm. Under that, what we have is a very complete rib cage and spine, although aspects like the spine here in really poor condition. With this individual, we're missing everything from the waist downwards. And this is because this is where Selecki had cut through the bottom half of this individual, unknowing, right? And I'll show you some pictures of his excavations, but this did influence how we decided to excavate Shanidar Zed. As I said, excavation was really challenging. So not only were we working in a very, very confined space, there was a lot of local interest, which is wonderful, but excavating something so delicate and potentially important with cameras over your shoulder is not particularly easy. The bones themselves are not fossilized, so they're very, very soft. And the sediment's also very soft. So the bones have to be consolidated in situ before they could be lifted. And as I said, Selecki, and we'll see this later, decided to remove Shanidar 4 because he was very fragile too. So Shanidar 4 was removed en bloc. Obviously, taking this into account and what had happened in terms of truncating the individual underneath, what I did, and this was a hard decision, was actually removed then these consolidated blocks in small sections, taking plans of each one and making sort of good use of where there are natural fractures, because obviously, given the debates about Shanidar and in general, it's not just the human remains that we're interested in. Obviously, they're really, really precious, but we need the context as well, right? And we don't want to lose that through just digging out a block. So these little blocks, and there were 20 odd, were first micro CT scanned as they were, and this was to help guide the excavation process of each one. So quite amazingly, and at the time of excavation, people kept saying to me, are you going to be able to reconstruct this skull? And I said, oh, yes, that'll be possible, thinking, what on earth am I saying? Luckily, we got a grant from the Templeton Foundation, and we were able to employ for 14 months Dr. Lucia Lopez-Bolin, who is a specialist conservationist, one of the best in the world, and she did the most amazing work. So this is the reconstruction of this skull that was flattened to about 2-3 centimeters thick. Amazing work. As you can see, the teeth are very heavily worn. We've got an abscess here, indicating an older woman, well, older by Neanderthal terms, which is maybe around 45, which as someone around that age is, particularly, gives me particular cause for thought. We conducted proteomics on the teeth. This was done by Frido Welker at the Globe Institute, and we were able to determine that she's likely female. The Kennis brothers did a most amazing reconstruction of what she may have looked like. So there you can see her here. And just to sort of fulfill what Tom said, this was done for a Netflix documentary, and you can see this is a screenshot of them working with a 3D print of the reconstructed skull. So there are big questions here, right? Was this individual intentionally buried? That's been a big question in general about Neanderthals, but especially at Shanidar Cave. So as we excavated, as I said, we tried to preserve that information about the context. Also took micromorphology blocks before that excavation. So here you can see an enlargement of one of the slides taken across this area of what could be a cut, right? This suggests very strongly that there is indeed a cut. So there's been intentional digging out before the body's put in. This is likely a natural water channel in the first place, but then it's been enhanced to accommodate the body. And this is shown by this kind of zone of compaction. So here we've got the sort of change in sediments, the ribs here lying across the bottom, and you get this zone of compaction. So if you imagine digging out a a small hole where you push down, that compacts the sediment underneath, just below what you're taking out. And so I'm not a micromorphologist, but this is what my colleagues tell me you can see here. We're also working still, Chris Hunt's working on the geochemistry, the pollen, and we're detecting as well some plant fragments within these sediments. So interesting questions about plant inclusions. There's also some evidence of other individuals here. So this is about 10 centimeters underneath the bottom of Shanidar Zed. We've got another very partial individual who we've called Shanidar A. So here you've got ribs, an articulated hand, and here the edge of a scapula, which turns out to be this one, the most amazing, complete, more or less, scapula dating to 75,000 years ago. It's really quite exceptional. This is a sort of schematic of those remains. So what I think is that this is the left side of an individual. Some of those remains have been disturbed, but they are in anatomical position relative to each other. The hand more or less as well. And we've got this cluster of teeth around the remains, which also seem to be from a single individual, likely older as well. And they're something that we're in the process of examining further at the moment, and I can talk more about those later. So not only that, but as the blocks were cleaned up and the reconstruction done, it seems like there are other individuals apart from Shanidar A there as well. So you'll notice here, for example, we've got some ribs. These are left ribs, still in anatomical position, flipped upside down and laying over each other in this sort of conformation. We've also got someone else's left shoulder here, but Shanidar Zed was missing her left ulna and left fifth metacarpal, suggesting that they might have been on the surface at some point and removed or eroded out. Articulated left shoulder, where the missing right arm of Shanidar Zed should be. So that seems to have been removed at some point. Perhaps suggesting that Shanidar Zed was disturbed and another individual put in on top. And then perhaps they were disturbed, remains pushed aside, and likely Shanidar 4 placed on top of those. Here also we've got a concentration of hand bones. When we found them in the section, I thought, oh, this is nice. This is a nice right hand. Actually, it's a mixture of two different people's right hands, partially articulated. So this is another mystery that we're trying to untangle at the moment. In terms of intentionality, so we've got this potential kind of redisturbing use of one place, the movement of other individuals out of the way, deposition of new ones on top. There's also this very tall rock here. So this is a slab that's fallen down from a geological fault in the ceiling above, and it's perhaps 2 meters tall, if not taller. It was in place before the Shanidar Zed A and B remains came into position. This is towards the mouth of the cave relative to the remains. So we've got all these individuals tucked in behind that. So perhaps that's how they were sort of a marker to come back to these same remains. Again, you can see it here with the excavations ongoing, and Shanidar 4 would have been just here. Shanidar 4, who I've been referring to, was actually part of a cluster. So this is the excavations of Shanidar 4 in process. You can see like the head, the spine and rib cage, the pelvis and lower limb, and the upper limbs here. The relationship between Shanidar Zed and these, so this is a bit of a crude mock-up that I have made. So remember, Seleki's block was cut across here and here. So we have the cut edge. This is the relationship then of Shanidar Zed to this Shanidar 4. So likely that the bottom half lay under Shanidar 4. I've referred to this as the cluster because, like I said, there's actually 3 other individuals in this block that Seleki took out. So 6, 8, and 9. 6 and 8 interpreted as 2 females. 9, some very fragmentary remains of a baby. So trying to unpick all of this, what is that relationship? How can we understand that further, where the remains have been truncated? In this respect, the archives of Ralph and his wife Rose, who you can see here, herself an eminent archaeologist, have been really, really critical. So these are the National Anthropological Archives of the Smithsonian. They've only been available since about 2018, thanks to the work of one of their sons, John Selecki, who you see here. And there's really critical information, things like original excavation diaries, individual record cards of all the squares and layers that they were excavating, and letters here, for example, this one to Dale Stewart, incorporating information that was not published elsewhere. So I've mentioned already that the excavation of Shanidar IV and these other individuals is important here in understanding these relationships. So I also mentioned that Shanidar IV, because they were very, very fragile, similar in preservation to Shanidar Zed, was removed en bloc so that the block could then be taken away, excavated in more controlled conditions, in this case in Baghdad. So this is Dale Stewart and Jacques Bourdaz preparing that block. So you can see some of the straw, some of the wood here. So I'm sure you're aware, but when you remove remains en bloc, essentially what you're doing is stabilizing the remains above, cutting all the way around them, sliding boards underneath, and then removing that all as one. These photos, I mean, Ralph Selecki took some amazing pictures, some of them in color. His pictures of the workmen and things like that are just beautiful. And most of these have not been published. So this is a photo showing that block containing Shanidar IV being brought up from the deep sounding. Shanidar IV is about 7.5 meters below the surface. And they had what they referred to sometimes as this bucket machine, this kind of transporter where they could move things up and down into the trench. So this initial stage of movement, probably not great for the remains inside, but what else were they to do? The remains, again, you can see them here. So once you've got them, or once they'd got them up to the cave surface, they then had to be carried down the side of the hill. So from that first photo, I don't know if you remember, but Shanidar Cave is sort of situated above a slope. It's in the foothills of the Barados Mountains, so not the easiest terrain to get this down. There's now a path that winds its way up there for tourists, but quite challenging at the time. To get this then back to Baghdad, it was lashed to the roof of a taxi and driven all the way. And as you can imagine, the roads are not kind of the quality that we have today. And even on today's roads, that probably wouldn't do the block much good. So when the block reached Baghdad, it spent a couple of years there. So this is 1960. Dale Stewart went back to Baghdad in 1962 to excavate this block specifically. It was not in great condition. It had dried out. It had also been turned upside down to aid with the excavation. So in a sense, or essentially, when he excavated it, there was a great deal of movement within it. And this is partly why he could not identify the individuals, right? He knew where Shanidar IV was and what the bones looked like, but Shanidar 6, 8, and 9, he really couldn't identify where they were from. So Shanidar 6 became defined as additional bones that duplicated anything from Shanidar 4, and Shanidar 8 became defined as duplicate bones that duplicated Shanidar 4 and Shanidar 6. So they're not necessarily discrete individuals. These are collections of bones that are not that are potentially from one or two individuals. So the other frustrating thing is in Dale Stewart's archives, which are also at the National Anthropological Archives at the Smithsonian, are very light on what they say about the excavation of that block. So I got very excited when I found that his archives were there, went to look through them, and mostly his diaries are about his daily life, about getting post from people at home. And there's the odd mention of Shanidar 4 being a bit of a nightmare. And that's pretty much it. I was hoping for some photos as well. There's mention of photos being taken. No photos from Dale Stewart at all. So to try and figure out where some of these remains were from, we had to go back to the original photos, but also some of the descriptions in the subsequent literature. Some of the literature then was based upon assumed interpretations of this photo. So what we have here in yellow, this is Shanidar 4's right arm. We've got his left humerus marked here in the dashed line, which would have been under the body. There's two bones here, more or less, and another one here that you can see. It's a bit difficult to see. This one then, in many publications after this, was assumed to be part of Shanidar 6. So we know from the published descriptions, the diaries, that while they were first excavating Shanidar 4, they were aware that there were some bones underneath that could be another individual. When they cut out the block, there were bones spilling out as well, they said. So again, they were aware that probably there's another individual. So this was the interpretation that's sort of been taken in subsequent publications, and you see repeated. However, if you look closely at these photographs, the pattern is not what's been reported. So we've got the right arm here, we've got the left humerus here. This bone is actually quite clearly the ulna, the left ulna of Shanidar 4. Again, from the drawings, there are, again in the archive, some amazing drawings that were taken on site at the time, which are annotated. And that's extremely useful because it gives us an interpretation, or what the interpretation was at the time of excavation. Sometimes that's changed over time. So there are, on some of these original drawings, Seleki's annotations in different colored pen, suggesting what he thought the remains were later on. But what we can see from the diagrams quite clearly, that's harder to see from the photos, is that Shanidar 4's left hand is here, sort of over the head, like this. So then it also makes much more sense. Not only does this look like the ulna in the photos, but here's the left hand around the head, right? So this makes anatomical sense. The only bits then that could potentially be what's been described as this other individual, which they ended up calling Shanidar 6, is perhaps a long bone here. We've got lots of fragments here. This is unidentifiable in the photos themselves. They also reported that there were some more kind of jumbled remains here, possibly here, possibly here, and this is where the cut went through here and here to remove the block. Ultimately, though, so I went through the archives, very hopeful, through all the diaries, through all the notes, through all the pictures, and the outcome was we still don't really know where the bones were, so quite disappointing. Interestingly as well, we weren't sure whether Seleki had actually identified these remains in the section as they removed Shanidar 4 in that block. So this here on the right is a close-up of how we found the remains once they've been tidied up. So you can see quite clearly the area of the cut, potentially here, and the remains. So we've got the right hands in here, got the rib cage here that we've seen. The skull was here. It was hard to identify that at the time. And some of the other bones here. So this is part of the other rib cage, part of another humerus, sorry, part of Zed's humerus, and that kind of jumble, which includes other people's cervical vertebrae, just a couple. So again, quite a complex situation it turned out to be. This here, and you can't see it that clearly, but again, we've got these amazing drawings from the time. We've also got other photos, some of them are in color, and they're pointing out something here, right? So here's that stone, the one we identified behind Dale Stewart's hand in some of the other pictures. You can see the correspondence here with the stone in situ when we found the remains. So we're very confident that we're in the right place. Although the section's not very clean, this arrow is pointing to some additional bones. And diagrams then describe these additional bones as well and show sort of two clusters, which almost fits in with what we could see. Selecki at the time thought this might be another individual, Shanidar 10. So the photos have sort of Shanidar 10 question mark written above them. Obviously, in the time since, in the 2000s, some infant remains were found in the animal bones that are at the Smithsonian. So they took on the name Shanidar 10. So it gets a little bit confusing. We've decided to call them then Shanidar Zed, Shanidar A, Shanidar B, and there's good reasons for that. People have asked quite a few times, Shanidar Zed, that sounds, really interesting. Is it to do with like World War Z and all these kind of things? And the explanation's really boring. So Selecki originally numbered the Neanderthal remains with Roman numerals. They were then renumbered, and this is described in Eric Trinkhouse's work, and using sort of Western Arabic numbers. Some of the numbers then swapped, so differences between the Roman numerals and the subsequent numbers. So we thought about Shanidar X, but then that could be a Roman numeral 10. So we didn't want to sort of make this confusion worse. So went for Shanidar Z, and I thought this was very sensible, and then realized I'd boxed us into a corner when we started finding remains of other people. So that's why we ended up with Shanidar A and Shanidar B. But yeah, so there's the story, not a very exciting one. But we're confident then, we're sure that Selecki knew these remains were there, but he didn't have time to excavate them. And he always intended and hoped to go back to excavate further at Shanidar. He got to the village a couple of times and no further because of various political issues. So he'd hoped to go back. And we've found then those remains that he knew were still there. So what's going on with all these remains? Obviously, it seems quite complex. This is my kind of mock-up of a section of how we might understand what's going on. So if we work up from the bottom, we've got Shanidar A, that scapula, those ribs, the scatter of teeth and the hand, with a good gap between those and Shanidar Z. So we've got Shanidar Z then here, placed in the ground subsequently, probably then partly disturbed, and Shanidar B, those fragmentary bits of sort of the left shoulder, the ribs that are still articulated, likely there and likely put on top. This then represents the block that was taken out by Selecki's team in 1960. Shanidar 6, possibly those remains that Stewart documents as being underneath Shanidar 4, but we don't know where. Sometimes he says that they're over more on this east side, sometimes more on the south. Very hard to be sure. And then on top of those, we have Shanidar 4. So one thing I'm wondering at the moment is whether, as I said, each individual was relatively recently deposited or buried. That's why we've still got articulation between the remains. They're then being disturbed each time by people coming back. Within a few years, I'm working with a sort of forensic and archaeological taphonomist, Aline Schotzman, to try and sort of figure out what this is what the sequence tells us, but it seems they were returning within perhaps maximum 10 years. So within living memory, disturbing the old remains, putting new individual in on top. Now, the flower burial. I mentioned this earlier. This is one of the most famous discoveries at Shanidar Cave. This, again, is that diagram we saw. You can see relative to the photos. Again, we've got the skull here. That left arm that's been misinterpreted in the photos, quite clearly drawn there in the hand. And as I said, these sediment samples taken from around the body and underneath reportedly contain these clusters of pollen. There was no sign of these kind of clusters anywhere else in the site, so they were interpreted as flowers having been put in the grave underneath the body. And hence you've got those complete clusters. This has been really controversial. So over the years, some people have argued that maybe it was brought in by his workmen, who Selecki says himself liked to tuck flowers into their waistbands. And this is one of Selecki's beautiful portraits from the archives. Some then more recently argued that perhaps it was Kurds burrowing down and bringing their flowers into their burrows, which they were known to do. Selecki did mention that there were burrows around the body, but we found no evidence of this in that area. Much further up, around 45,000 years ago, lots and lots of burrows. This level, virtually none. And this may have come about because of the interpretation of what seems to be sort of a pipe next to those, next to that vertical stone, where there's been loose sediment trickling down. My colleague Chris Hunt has more recently looked into this, looked at those original images of the pollen clusters. He's found that rather than being distinct flowers, they're actually mixtures of pollen from different flowers. The most likely explanation for this is that it's been brought in by burrowing bees. So they have a mixture of pollen from flying around different flowers, and then bring this into their burrows. And so here you can see the bottom of one of those bees digging into the side of the trench, very close to where we excavated Shanidar Zed. But you can also find still today both modern burrows, but also as evidence of ancient burrows, these sort of clay-lined long structures that we can identify, including underneath the remains of Shanidar Zed. So for us, this seems to be the most likely explanation. Although the flower burial then probably doesn't stand, this has overshadowed what I think is even more interesting evidence, this cluster, right? This cluster of individuals within a space this big. And we're looking at 4, 5, hard to be sure at the moment, but that in itself is quite remarkable. And the fact that they're coming back to this one spot in a huge cave seems to be something that really suggests some kind of repetitive behavior, some kind of mortuary, perhaps funerary behavior. So just to finish up, I promised you a little bit on the living and how that links into what's being done with the dead bodies. So here we've got an image of the section, so similar to the one that we saw before. Here are the Shanidar Zed remains in section. And essentially what we've got is this gully that I mentioned, this natural kind of water channel here that's visible. Here's that pipe that I mentioned. Here's that huge rock pillar. So we have those in one dip sort of thing. We've got then this kind of slope upwards, a levee, where this is kind of leading to the trickle of materials, slumping materials, both this side and this side. Then here we see quite good evidence of things like burning, lots of charcoal. You can see that in the darker layers, indicating day-to-day living, right? It's not super dense, but we see processed animal bone, these combustion features. This is a phase in between, so we've got layers of rockfall here where we don't see people so much. This then is another section. I know this looks quite complicated, but the key bits, so here we've got the level of Shanidar Zed, Shanidar 4 at this height, Shanidar A down here. If we keep going further down, and we've taken this down at least another meter, so down to about 8.5 meters, again, we see these layers with combustion features, ash, and scatters of animal bone. And this is sort of a quick shot down into that extended area, and you can see quite clearly these layers of combustion features. So essentially, people are living really close to where those remains are, sort of in arm's reach, if you like. So there's this close association potentially between the living and the dead, living spaces and where the dead are being deposited. Finally, some amazing work that I wanted to highlight from one of our colleagues, Cheran Kabuku at Liverpool, looking at some of the charred fragments from these combustion features that turn out to be small fragments of burnt food. This includes some pulses, but also some grass seeds, and these are the electron micrographs of those, for those of you who know more about this than I do. What they suggest is that there's both soaking of these things like the pulses, but also then cooking. So we often hear much about how Neanderthals were consuming a meat-heavy diet. That's probably the case, but this is really important and rare evidence of how they're using plants from the landscape as well. Thinking about the sort of broader project then, we have a few challenges, if you like. Communication to the wider public is one that's really important, we would argue, and as many, I think, would argue as well, not just us. So we have a website in 3 languages. It's needing a bit of an update. Again, as Tom mentioned, the Netflix documentary, which, even though I wasn't keen on being filmed, it's actually been really important for dissemination. And in Kurdistan in particular, people are super proud of what they see as the mother of Kurdistan, the reconstruction of Shanidar Zed. One of the other issues that we have is the publication of negative findings. So we have attempted to extract ancient DNA from Shanidar Zed with no luck. That's working with Matthias Mayer's group. S.K. Willislev has also attempted to extract ancient DNA from Shanidar 5, no luck. I understand that Svante Parbo in the past has tried to extract DNA, no luck. We've tried to do work on proteomics with the animal bones, no luck. Sediment DNA, maybe, so far no luck. But it's really important that these negative results are put out there, right? Because what we see potentially is the repeated sampling of the same remains or remains from the same site when we essentially have good evidence that this isn't going to work with the technology we have right now. Other things that we're in discussion about are things like how we store these remains. They're on loan from the Directorate of Antiquities and Heritage, and they will go back to Kurdistan. So how do we ensure their safety there? And how do we incorporate them into an improved visitor experience? How also do we build capacity in the region? The remains came on loan to Cambridge. It would have been wonderful if they could stay in Kurdistan. And I've mentioned as well the wider communication and outreach, and that's something that we want to continue with updates. So we need time to work on the website. Okay, so thank you very much for listening. Many people to say thank you to. So Graham Barker, Tim Reynolds and Chris Hunt as the directors of the project, the Kurdistan Directorate of Antiquities and Heritage and the local directorate as well, the regional government, all the people who've worked on the project, those at the archives, the Selecki family themselves, and various people who've been important in sort of having discussions with me about the remains. Obviously, our funders, without whom none of this would have happened. And then especially the people of Kurdistan. For those of you looking closely, we have much better fences around the excavations now for safety reasons, now that they're very deep. But Shanidar Cave is somewhere that Kurdish people do come and visit, especially on Saturdays and Fridays. Some people coming in wonderful traditional dress. Especially now they've seen it on Netflix, there is a renewed pride in this incredibly important site. And we are just so fortunate and so grateful to be able to work at this really amazing place. Okay, and thank you for your attention.